谢谢大家回谢北北时间，我是大叔上。
我是大叔家。
哇，今天这个我们就直接跳进这个台海关系啊。那这个，请问一下大叔家，我们今天要又哪一位厉害专家来跟我们分享他们的看法呢？
是的，我们今天是邀请的Sean King 回到我们节目这边，再跟我们聊聊台海的关系。那其实大家要是记得的话，这不是他第一次来跟我们聊啦。那还是简单的介绍一下他的一些背景。那Sean King现在是美国纽约的 Park Strategies，它是一个政治公关公司、政治顾问公司的一个资深的副总。那他在过去呢，也在美国这个联邦政府担任过资深的顾问，然后他过去当然也是在亚洲，然后这个在台湾都有一些实体，就是一些实战的一些工作上的一些经验，所以我们是很欢迎他今天来到我们现场，跟我们聊一下这个从裴洛西之后的一些台海的一些变化。
是啊，就是那个自从裴洛西来之后，就还蛮热闹的，什么看烟火啦，这个看电视啊等等，这个时候讲一下那个大署长自己也是一个受灾户这样子，不过这是另外一个故事了，所以我们其实就是想说请他来分享一下这种比较是美国包括国会山庄的一些看法这样子。那当然在录音的时候，他也提醒说这个台湾的现在状况的变化非常快，所以呢，别的不要说，那个 Pelosi 之后又有一团一团的这个观光团来，这个也是非常的热闹。好，那我们就现在进入节目喽。
Guys, great to be with you and your listeners again. Thank you.
Yeah, now it's we have heard Sean before, but now it's time to listen to what Sean has to share with everybody. And so if I may, 大叔家, if you would start the question.
Sure. Welcome back to us, Sean. Very much honored to have you back. Now, lots of things have happened since we talked last time, and naturally, China appears to be somewhat bent out of shape by Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan earlier this month. Now, many people compare their latest military drill to those in 1996. However, it appears to me as a casual observer that they have gone beyond the scope of Taiwan. And as far as I understand, a few missiles actually landed in the so-called exclusive economic zone of Japan near Okinawa. In your opinions, what is China trying to send in terms of messages to perhaps Taiwan and the neighboring countries in East Asia?
I think the message, especially given the circular nature of the drills that they surrounded Taiwan in these 6 or 7 zones, simulating some kind of blockade or quarantine. I think the message is, give up now. Resistance is futile. We have you surrounded. Don't even think about resisting. And whenever we've been thinking about defending Taiwan, we've always thought about defending the West Coast against an invasion from the mainland over 100 miles of rough water. And, we remember the only successful amphibious landing that hasn't been one since 1950, the Incheon landing with MacArthur in the Korean War. But this brings in a whole new element to it that we would have to be defending Taiwan from the East Coast as well. And that could then cut off U.S. and Japanese supply routes to Taiwan from U.S. bases in Okinawa and also U.S. bases in the Commonwealth and Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, and Hawaii. So, and lobbing those 5 missiles in Japan's EEZ, I think it's Beijing's way of saying, America, don't even think about coming to Taiwan's defense from Okinawa. In Japan, don't you think about supporting Taiwan or the U.S. in any which way. So I think it's a multi-coordinated strike, hopefully from Beijing's point of view, just to get people to give up and submit. So it's a very worrying signal indeed.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, going beyond Taiwan to other countries like Japan, that has always been sort of been suggested, but it appears this time is a lot more serious than in the past.
Yeah.
How, from your own conversations and whatnot, how has Japan taken this message so far?
Thankfully, they've been very upfront about it, lodging protests, calling in the ambassador, speaking up at ASEAN, and Beijing's not interested because if you read Beijing's telling of history, Japan is the reason Taiwan is not under PRC control today, because that was the colonial era that took Taiwan away from China. So that almost feeds into Beijing's own internal propaganda. Mm-hmm. But I'm very happy to see Japan, unlike Korea, really speaking up on this issue. And just on the drills themselves, what's kind of unsettling about it, it was a multi-military force coordination together with a very glossy propaganda blitz at home that was obviously planned months, if not years in advance. This can't be because Nancy Pelosi decided to visit Taiwan when U.S. legislators go to Taiwan all the time. This was obviously planned in advance, and they were looking for an excuse to do it. And in the past, like on the previous program, we talked about things in Pratas Islands or this gray zone area. I kind of wrote it off because that wasn't proper Taiwanese territory. But this is proper Taiwanese territory. I mean, these are regular crossings of the median line, which is not official, but kind of understood between the two sides. Things over Penghu Island, which is historically part of Taiwan, missiles over Taiwan proper. And again, this quasi-quarantine or blockade on the East Coast. So yeah, it is new. When I heard Admiral Davidson testify in the Senate and say, there could be a PRC invasion by 2027, I think a lot of us thought he was being a little hysterical and maybe unnecessarily worrisome. But I think that now, based on what we've seen in the last few weeks, that's no longer out of the question. Right. The question is the PRC's risk tolerance? When do they think is the time to strike? But, I'm not panicking short term, but medium to long term, I'm much more concerned than I was a few weeks ago. And I've been checking in with some friends of mine in Taiwan, asking them what they think. And I get the sense is that they're going on with their lives, but it does seem a little different this time. Maybe it's in the back of their heads for the, not too distant future. So since you guys are in Taiwan, I'd be interested to hear what you say living through this. What's the mood there?
Right. Well, I think you're absolutely right, Sean, that this time is much more visible, and I can give two examples. The first one is somewhat comical, which is that one of the blockade zones is on the southeast of Taiwan, and there are quote unquote tourists who are taking fishing boats out, hoping to see missile being fired because we've never seen this. So I think on one hand, people kind of taking this in stride. With that said, there have been fairly extensive and more importantly, very public cyber attacks. I think just sort of the cyber attack. They would like deface the presidential websites in Taiwan, which honestly, nobody goes to their website. But this time they were able to hack into the Taiwan railway station signages and the local convenience store signage. That's right.
7-Eleven convenience store in Kaohsiung with Nancy Pelosi's face. And
exactly. So it became, it's much more present. I mean, although they did take down the signage very quickly, but it definitely made the news. And I think I think internally within Taiwan, there also been some degree of official, I don't know if this is the right word, but hysteria, right? Because they were saying that, wait a minute, for the longest time we're using Huawei hardwares. Maybe that's why, and then there is some degree of sort of almost like witch hunts and try to figure out, what is, what isn't. But I think it's at the same time, people also realize how very intertwined Taiwan and China are, despite the political issues. So.
And 96 was a year before I first went to Taiwan and really started following it. And I've heard stories that people were stocking up on food in 96 and looking for passports from other countries. There's not that kind of panic. But at the same time, while people are laughing it off by treating it as a tourist destination on the coast, I've also heard that air raid shelters and bomb shelters was one of the most downloaded apps in Taipei 2 weeks ago.
That is actually correct.
Yeah.
Everybody's looking at each other and going like, do you know where the shelter is? I think it's sort of this kind of a split personality, if you will, actually makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I try to think of myself as a South Korean. I mean, they're just miles away from Pyongyang. I mean, if they think about this on a daily basis, they won't be able to conduct their daily affairs. So
right.
On one hand, people are very much on alert, and you get the sort of the academic types talking about it in a more rational manner. And then, the rest of us, normal people or the peasants, whatever, we just kind of try to be calm and carry on, because at the end of the day, most people rationalize it as like, what else can I do? And then there's of course the small minority of people out there going like, how do I get my second passport? But that's sort of all sort of anecdotal information. But for the most part, if you go out to the streets, I mean, this is very much sort of another day in Taipei. Without major panic. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And another thing that really worries me about this is that Beijing and Xi Jinping has always said that Beijing's red line, going back to the 2005 anti-secession law, was a formal declaration of Taiwanese independence. In the statement that the PRC put out, sort of explaining or justifying the drills around Taiwan in response to Pelosi's visit, it accused the United States of collusion with Taiwanese independence forces and separatist forces. But I've heard Tsai Ing-wen 2 or 3 times clearly say that she has no need to declare Taiwanese independence because her government's already independent as the Republic of China, Taiwan.
Right.
And she pledged allegiance to the Republic of China Constitution in her first inauguration speech, which is a one China document that even references Mongolia and Tibet. And she herself got stick from the green side of the political spectrum for speaking in a memorial park for Zheng Jinghua in January, kind of trying to rehabilitate the anti-dictator. I mean, I think she's trying to bring in the different ethnic strands of Taiwanese political life. So if anything, all her speech is against formal Taiwanese independence, and Beijing is accusing Taiwan's government of that. I hate to draw these parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan, but that worryingly reminds me a little bit of Vladimir Putin in February, justifying his invasion of Ukraine by saying he had to do this because these Ukrainian Nazis were attacking ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. It seems like Beijing's just going to make it up and say whatever they want to justify whatever they're going to do. And I don't want to give them ratings, but I suffered through the PRC ambassador to the U.S. op-ed in the Washington Post at the time. And he's just making stuff up left and right, talking about Taiwan and Chinese for 1,800 years, telling a press club that Biden could have stopped Pelosi if he wanted to. As Josh Rogan in the Washington Post called it, it's like mainland Chinese alternative facts. And you read the PRC policy paper on Taiwan that came out last week, the first one since 2000. It labels the one country, two system model in Hong Kong a success and saying the Taiwanese want to be part of the motherland. And again, all these fake claims to Taiwan's proper land mass. So it's concerning. I think this is a big wake-up call. And also that policy paper mentioned Xi Jinping thought and the Communist Party of China. Could you imagine, like, if the U.S. Treasury Department had put out a statement on interest rates, or the Pentagon had put out a policy paper and mentioned the Democratic Party and Joe Biden thought, what are we dealing with here? I mean, obviously we're coming at this from very different systems and worlds. Something's really going on. And this is a big wake-up call. And before we get too down on ourselves, let's remember that our views of these drills are Beijing's own Hollywood production video of what happened. We're only seeing the stuff that went well. And this was with no US, no Japanese, or no Taiwan resistance at all. We just sat back and watched. And surely we've learned a lot too from what they did. So it's not a total loss. But I think Taiwan can look at this as sort of a Sputnik moment. Like, this is the big wake-up call. What are we going to do about it now that we know? And my friend Matthew Fulco wrote in Al Jazeera the other day, you also have to think about the business impact. Like, companies aren't going to leave Taiwan tomorrow. But the next time a company is doing a 5-year roadmap for where they're going to be and where they're going to invest and where they're going to hire and where they're going to have a new research center, just like companies started leaving Hong Kong when leases came due after the crackdown there. You know, someone's going to think, do I really want to hire people here? Do I want to invest here if this is going to happen? Maybe Singapore makes more sense. Maybe South Korea makes more sense. You know, they have a threat too, but at least there's 28,500 troops there, guaranteed from the U.S., guaranteed by a U.S.-South Korean defense treaty. So these are just things we have to take in mind. It's, you know, not time to panic, but it's a big wake-up call. And another thing, because I asked you what you thought being there, I also heard some people say, you know, nobody asked the Taiwanese what they thought of Pelosi's visit before she went there. But the fact that she was welcomed there by a twice overwhelmingly elected Democratic government, I mean, that's why you have elections. Presumably, that's an expression of the people's will. As an American, I was very moved. I watched live her arrival and seeing people literally run across the street at the Grand Hyatt to catch a glimpse of her motorcade. You know, it reminded me of those videos of the Beatles arriving at JFK in 1964. So,
well, they probably sing better.
People hung up, you know, plane spotting, waiting for her flight at Songshan, which I've done myself to watch domestic flights. You know, it's very moving as an American, see the connection. And speaking of the flight, another thing that has not gotten mentioned that sort of dawned on me the other day, I hate, again, to conflate these issues, South China Sea and Taiwan, especially because I consider Taipei, on paper at least, part of the problem in the South China Sea. But by Nancy Pelosi flying around the South China Sea to avoid interception, was that like a de facto American acceptance of PRC sovereignty over that body of water? You know, we say we're going to sail and fly wherever international law allows us to. And that's great when it's a gunboat going through for a day, innocent passage or whatever. But when it came down to it, when our Speaker of the House was there, we didn't want to risk it. So will this be, look back and say, this is the day that basically America gave up and accepted Beijing's dominance over the South China Sea because Nancy Pelosi was afraid to fly over it? I don't know, but I think that's another thing that may come out later that we haven't given enough attention to as this thing is unfolding.
Well, you know, I mean, on that point, on that point, Sean, I'd love to sort of get your at least your personal opinion. All this issue obviously are stating the facts. But what is the American sentiment right now? It's like, gosh, this is gonna suck, and then what?
Yeah, on Taiwan, I think people are outraged by Beijing's, Beijing's reaction. And Biden's pretty measured. You know, no one's going to accuse him of trying to provoke Beijing here. And it wasn't his call to make whether or not she goes. I think most people are outraged by what happened, but also based on what we saw in Afghanistan last year, do we really have the stomach for this if something does happen? Because we're so far away. We only have a few hundred troops there for training. Could we get there in time, especially what we see with the possible blockade on the East Coast? You know, most people know Taiwan is friendly. They play baseball. They have democracy, But, you know, most people don't follow the ins and outs of this issue.
Okay,
sure.
So South Korea, North Korea is easier to understand because of the nukes, the Korean War, and Kim Jong-un is, you know, his own creation. But this is a little harder to understand. But I think most people are outraged. But, you know, now what are we going to do about it?
Right. No, that's a very good point. I mean, this may actually be a good segue to, you know, our next topic, which is how should South Korea feel about this? I mean,
how should we feel about South Korea's reaction? That's the better question.
Both, right? I mean, the president was quote unquote on vacation when Nancy Pelosi visited. Right. And then, you know, apparently due to public pressure domestically, he caved and said, well, you know, I better call just to say hi, right? So, you know, I mean, obviously Korea is trying to stay, you know, in the good graces of China, but would that work, first of all? And secondly, you know, again, I mean, it's from the U.S. perspective, U.S. should think about Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, you know, sort of in one package. I mean, obviously China is trying to play the divide and conquer game here. should South Korea cave, that you're looking at a very different story, right?
Yeah, well, I've never thought we could count on Korea when it comes to Taiwan. He was on a staycation in Seoul, and he did not have time to meet with the Speaker of the House, even though the leaders of Singapore, Japan, and Taiwan did.
Sure.
And of course, we all wish Japanese Prime Minister Kishida a speedy recovery from COVID-19. And let's remember, Nancy Pelosi was supposed to go to Taiwan in April, but she got COVID-19. So that's why it happened at this time. It wasn't time to happen now.
Right.
So he didn't have time to meet the Speaker of the House, but he did have time to have dinner and post it on social media with some actors from a local South Seoul theater that he attended. So that really upset people. And I'm very happy to see the South Korean public want him to meet with Pelosi, because there's been a tremendous shift away from sort of a neutral stance on China in Korea in favor of the United States. And it wasn't always that way. So the South Korean public was clearly in America's corner. And what disappoints me about Yoon's not meeting Pelosi is he ran as the pro-U.S. candidate.
That's right.
He accused his predecessor, Moon Jae-in, and the Liberal Party candidate, Lee, by association, of engaging in what he called equidistant diplomacy between Washington and Beijing, drawing a moral equivalence. And he said, no, we have to clearly stand with the United States against Beijing. And he has done some things I like. His administration has defended to Beijing the right to have more THAAD anti-missile batteries. We're going to start this week full-on exercises between South Korea and the United States for the first time since 2017. And very pointedly, he's calling for North Korea's complete denuclearization as opposed to complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which is a more neutral thing. Now, neither is going to happen, but at least he's calling it what it is. But this is disappointing. And, if he's afraid to meet Nancy Pelosi, what else is he afraid to do? And I think this is just another reminder that Seoul will not help in a Taiwan contingency. And we should think that Seoul and Taipei get along because they're in similar situations, but there's a lot of bad blood between the two sides. South Korea thinks that Chiang Kai-shek meddled in the Korean War for his own purposes. And when Seoul very abruptly established diplomatic relations with Beijing in 1992 and did not tell Taipei, Taipei responded by not allowing either Korean Air or Asiana to land on Taiwan for 12 years. Yeah. And then it went both ways. And then EVA and China Airlines were not allowed in South Korea. So my first trips to and from Seoul and Taipei were on Cathay Pacific, because you had to fly either Singapore Airlines, Thai Airways, or Cathay for 12 years before they resumed these things. So there's a lot of tension under the surface. Also, I think that South Korea, given its own tortured relationship with Japan, does not understand, can't accept Taiwanese fondness for Japan. Right. Historically, they're very divergent experiences and outlooks. So always, I never thought South Korea still hopes against hope that Beijing will help deliver it North Korea, and that's not going to. So we can't count on any help from South Korea in a Taiwan contingency. And I don't think we should take the troops away from there anyway in the U.S. case, because then it could leave it vulnerable to a second North Korean attack. So I think Japan could help, Australia too, but now it's South Korea. Generally, I kind of like where Moon's going on balance, but more than Moon is, Yoon. But on this Nancy Pelosi thing, I was very disappointed and was hoping he would apologize to the speaker, but sadly, he has not yet.
Well, you heard it here.
Yes.
Well, just if I may, just to sort of throw in a few more things that contribute to this so-called rivalry or competitive spirit between Taiwan and Korea. Part of it is also the economic development of both countries. I mean, I think they're in many different many similar sectors where the two countries' companies would actually compete against each other, not the least of which would be semiconductor, which of course is a very hot topic right now. So it's in theory you would think these two countries would work together, but yeah, in reality, like you said, Sean, it's if you look a little closer, has always been somewhat of a rivalry going on, both on a sort of a geopolitical, emotional, cultural, a bunch of issues. So well, thank you for your sobering words right there.
Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead.
Oh no, just so sort of circling back to Taiwan. I mean, obviously, the Taiwan security ultimately is up to Taiwan. With that said, any thoughts, Sean, on how does this make Washington D.C. think in terms of maybe different legislations or other ways of providing preemptive support as opposed to post attack supports?
Well, Congress has long been the driver on Taiwan policy in Washington D.C. ever since derecognition in '79, and I'm a Republican, but I like to remind my fellow Republicans it was Richard Nixon who betrayed Chiang Kai-shek by going to the PRC, and it was a Democratic Congress that pushed and signed into legislation, into law, the Taiwan Relations Act. So this has never been a partisan issue. There's just generally been the legislative branch is very supportive of Taiwan, and the executive branch is always trying to play things more down the middle. It wasn't until Trump and now Biden's continued it where you have a very sort of pro-Taiwan attitude in the executive branch as well. And we're coming up on big midterm elections here in a few months. And the Senate is still kind of up for grabs or down the middle, but the House is very likely going to switch to Republican control. That's another reason why, as an American, I thought it was very good that Nancy Pelosi go on this trip now, so that if a Republican speaker wants to go next year, nobody can say they're doing it just for politics to embarrass the White House. So it shows that Democrats and Republicans alike support Taiwan. And she herself has a very consistent history on these issues. She's been a big backer of Taiwan since 1991 and very critical of the PRC, unfurling a banner in Tiananmen Square and also going to India to pray with the Dalai Lama. So it wasn't like she was playing any politics. I mean, this is who she is and what she believes. So expect continued legislation in the Congress. If Republicans do take the House, there may be like an extra pointed angle on it, perhaps to embarrass the White House coming up from the 2024 presidential election. But the big piece of legislation under consideration now is called the Taiwan Policy Act. And I've read through that a few times. And, just some of the things that stuck out to me: calls for no U.S. governmental restrictions on interaction with Taiwan government officials. That's good. Calls for regular reporting on the Taiwan Travel Act Trump had signed into law in 2018, which removes all restrictions on travel back and forth, which is another reason why I didn't understand what the big deal about the Pelosi trip was, because it's very consistent with the Travel Act. But also interesting, he says that Taiwan officials in the United States should be free to display and fly the Republic of China flag, which I think is great, because I think the more we can embrace the ROC as a construct, the better, because it kind of puts the Taiwanese independence issue to the side and, helps debunk this PRC lie that we're moving toward formal Taiwanese independence. So any use of the ROC is fine by me. Then they want to rename TECRO the Taiwan Representative Office. Now, I want to know how Taipei feels about that. And again, there was a time when it was in Beijing's interest for Taiwan to be known as Taiwan, because then they were competing to be China. And when the International Olympic Committee offered the team in Taipei the name Taiwan in the Montreal Olympics, they left and went home. So if you live long enough, everything comes around full circle. Like my dad says, when he was a kid, his mother was told, give your kid lots of red meat and sun and they'll be healthy. So, so I guess so. But I'd like to see a day when we can say Embassy of the Republic of China in Washington, D.C. Taiwan. Let's forget this Taiwan stuff. Let's go straight to the ROC. Dual recognition is my dream, but only if it's okay with Taipei. And we have to now, in this new reality, worry about what the countermeasures would be, because even though that would be further delaying Taiwanese independence, Beijing may twist that for their own purposes, the way they are at the Pelosi visit. Another interesting thing in the legislation, it says that the director of AIT will no longer be called a director, but be called a representative, and should require Senate confirmation like an ambassador.
Wow.
That could be helpful in that it would cause like public discussion of Taiwan issues. Very rarely does Taiwan, unless it's some esoteric trade issue or defense thing, it's rarely on C-SPAN or rarely part of the nightly news. But if you have a confirmation of a representative to Taiwan, that could cause a really good, healthy U.S. public debate on Taiwan. There's also the Taiwan Security Assistance Initiative, where we would give $4.5 billion for Taiwan to buy weapons and services and things. I don't know about that. I mean, if Taiwan needs this stuff so much, shouldn't they put up the money yourselves? It's almost like, why give them money to buy stuff that they need? Because I don't think money's the issue. We would designate Taiwan as a major non-NATO ally in this legislation. Ally is tricky because ally connotes a formal obligation to defend. And how can you formally defend someone you don't recognize? You know, we have an embassy in Singapore. We worked with them in Iraq and Afghanistan, but Singapore is not an ally because we have no obligation to defend Singapore. Sweden will now become an ally through NATO, but it wasn't until now. Japan and South Korea and Australia are allies. But, you know, Switzerland is not. So how can you be a major non-NATO ally if Taiwan's not an ally to begin with? And the two other things that caught my eye was the legislation supports Taiwan's participation in the Inter-American Development Bank, Latin America. I think that's very important because, you know, Taipei lost Nicaragua, almost lost Honduras, and now Beijing is definitely making the most of its new relationship in Panama. So if we can help fortify and stabilize Taipei's relations in the Western Hemisphere, that's very good. And also calls for a Taiwan fellowship program. A lot of study and research on Taiwan, sending fellows there. I think Taiwan has a great story to tell on soft power, especially as more media and academia leaves the PRC and there's more of a crackdown there from Beijing. Anything we can do to show Taiwan's soft power, openness, marriage equality, free speech, internet, no censorship, you know, that's stuff that really resonates with people. And one of the reasons South Korean youth, for example, are really gravitating toward Taiwan these days compared to what they see happening in Hong Kong. And then lastly, the legislation mentions getting Taiwan in IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, finishing the TIFA, a free trade agreement. Okay, fine. But what's really sad is that the U.S. doesn't get back into TPP. Because if we were in TPP, which was a regional economic power play against Beijing, we could actively support Taiwan's membership in TPP. And I think that would count more than all this other stuff combined. So I think there's some confusing stuff. It'll probably pass. And I think in a new Republican House Congress, just expect more of this with maybe a little bit more of a partisan edge. And that's where I see things in DC right now.
Great, thanks. I mean, that's a great overview. And by the way, with Trump and his allies, you know, imminently coming back to both Congress and who knows about the White House, are you expecting any curveballs on Taiwan issues alone? I mean, traditionally they've been supportive, but who knows?
You don't know, because a lot of the congressional followers of Trump, they have an isolationist streak too. And sort of a predilection for strong authoritarian leaders. You know, a lot of these people, like on Fox News, they've even questioned our defense and support of Ukraine. And they've all been pro-Taiwan because Taiwan's anti-mainland China. So that's fine for now. But when you start thinking it through, and the fact that Biden seemed friendly to Taiwan, that may be enough for them to oppose Taiwan. I don't know. Right now, I don't see any members of Congress, especially on the Republican side, being anti-Taiwan. But were Trump to be president again, you never know what curveballs he himself would throw in. But you got to be honest, for whatever reason, Trump was great for Taiwan. If you just look at like a profit and loss statement, Trump was very good for Taiwan. And Biden's been as good, if not better, going. He's kept that going. But I'm not going to complain about anything Trump did on Taiwan because he was very good for the island.
Well, thank you very much. On that final word, I think our time's up. I want to thank you again for joining us and sharing with us such wonderful insight and insightful thoughts. And we hope to be able to invite you back very soon again.
That's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
哇，真的很感谢Sean他这个讲话条理，而且其实他就是从一个很美国中心的角度来看这件事情，跟我们坐在台湾的感觉是很不一样的。然后当然也不否认了，现在就是美国也是要这个所谓的期中选举了，所以跟他有点类似。哎呀，真的是很热闹。所以呢，大叔家你觉得呢？
刚才讲到选举，又想到说，哎，其实11月份不止美国选举啊，台湾也有一个选举啊，所以这个，然后那个中国也有他们自己的选举啊，他们10月底嘛，对不对？所以那我就常常想说，哎呀，这个美国两党很少有这种想法一致，但是常常在讲说，现在在华府台湾议题是少数有共识的议题。那个现在我慢慢发现，当然这个中国议题、台湾议题，最近这几年在美国华盛顿地区也是变成显学啦，所以我常常想说，哇，这个来台湾这个美国议员、两党议员，或是两党跟两院的议员来台湾，这个骂中国只有加分啊，特别是他们自己也要在选举嘛，所以这个美国两党两院这个日韩台的旅游团已经是络绎不绝，然后至少到10月之前，应该都是一个新常态啦。所以接下来就看老共怎么接招。那重点是，那台湾这个接待也接待到手软，所以
好忙哦。
就有个朋友讲说，哎呀，那个大股东说要来视察公司，我们这个管理阶层没有权利说不啊。
这个常常要准备欧米亚给，好辛苦
真的好累哦。大陆长觉得呢？
是啊，是啊，我觉得这个是比较有在关心这个美国跟中国关系的人都知道，美国过去5年到10年对中国之间的关系有很大的反省啊，其实他们之前觉得就是他还是永远的老大，然后呢，中国只要做一个称职的老二，大家可以世界和平这样子。那当然就说他们觉得，诶，这个好像有人在问鼎这样子，所以这个会是一个比较长期的一个脉络这样子。那也就像大叔甲提到的，就是所谓的新常态。那这边其实我很明显的啦，就是说这种东西都不是纯粹是政治，不管是那个那叫什么演练。对，这个叫演练啊。可是这个是军事某种程度，它只是一种外面看得到的，可是里面政治啦、经济的这些，它这是一个是很 dynamic，一直是在变动的过程，而且是有很多层面。我觉得这一点跟Sean讨论也觉得真的就是看门道的是他在看的是这一块。
的确啊，所以我们请向来嘛，因为他自己坦白讲不是军事专家，他是一个政治的这个工作者，那个顾问。那当然他看到的层次就比较多一点。刚才大署长讲的就是这个军事政治，然后各个层次领域。那讲到这个，我就说，哎，其实今年刚刚好8月28号，在几天前，这个美国大都会 Mets 也慎重的举办了第17届的台湾日台湾 Day。那我自己的观察是，他们也是越办越热闹。那这个其实据说啊，不是据说，确实是这样的，有图为证啊，就是恰恰也被邀请去开球嘛。那从这个角度，就是意味着说，美国的民间在美国的民间，台湾这个议题是有市场的。然后我想就是这种长期的深化，就不只是政治而已，就透过文化啦、民间的交流，也是一个很重要的一个外交的一环。那所以这个我们很高兴，像这个8月28号有亲自到现场去帮我们拍几张照，跟我们分享。所以这个我们也是很高兴可以看到说，哎，台湾这个议题在美国是受欢迎的。那这个就是回到我们刚刚讲，就是说其实这些所谓的新常态，就是不只是政治跟军事而已，它有各个其他可以更深化的层次。那所以我们这个部分就到这里。那大树上，我们下个礼拜要聊些什么呢？
是我们下个礼拜会继续讨论从台湾看天下。我们很高兴邀请到小薇，也是创国本节目的，因为她最近在德国做了一些研究，所以我们就邀请她来分享从德国人怎么看台湾的这个观点。我们今天节目先到这边，谢谢大家的收听，拜拜，
拜拜。
谢谢大家收听本集的谢伯伯时间。在本集节目结束前，要来好好感谢我们最棒的幕后团队，我是 Ariel， 还有 Oliver、Hannah， 还有 Lalisa， 以及门面担当大叔嗓、大叔甲。如果你喜欢我们的节目，别忘了按下订阅和5颗星的评论哦。另外，也祝大家在疫情期间都能平安健康。那我们就下集见，拜拜。